You are now listening to the Unscripted Ohio podcast, brought to you by Buckeye Grove. For all the latest Buckeyes news, analysis, reaction, and the best Ohio State community on the entire internet, head over to BuckeyeGrove.com or follow us on Twitter at Ohio State Rivals. Without any further delay, it's time to get unscripted, broadcasting from Podcast Central, a place that is not his mother's basement.
Hey, Mom! We get some meatloaf!
We promise. Here's your host, Kyle Lamb.
Hey, Mom! The meatloaf!
Good Monday. Welcome back to Unscripted Ohio, presented by BuckeyeGrove.com. I am your host, Kyle Lamb. I hope everybody had a great weekend. I know I am very excited for the show today. Coming off a tremendous first Friday episode where we had Joel Klatt of Fox. Just a great interview, one of the best that I personally have had the pleasure of having in my career, both as a beat writer and now as a podcast host. He was insightful. He had a lot of personality, just some great opinions. There are even some things in that interview on Friday that, I didn't necessarily agree with him that 4 is the right number as far as playoffs are concerned. I would personally like to see it expanded to 8. But everything he says, whether I agreed with it or disagreed with it, he presents it in such a fair, honest, sincere, genuine way that it's hard to argue with anything he says. He truly was a great interview. If you didn't already check it out, go back to the archives. As you probably know, we're on Google Play, iTunes, SoundCloud, and Stitcher. Go back and check out Friday's episode. You will definitely want to hear what Joel Klatt has to say. I hope to goodness that we can get him back on the show. As you probably can guess, he's a very busy guy with his obligations with Fox, so it's not going to be easy, but sometime here before the end of the season, I would like to get Joel Klatt back on. Of course, Kevin Noon had some great stuff on Brian Hartline taking over at wide receivers coach, Mark Gibler with some great recruiting information. So it was a tremendous step forward for the Unscripted Ohio podcast as we did our first Friday edition successfully, and now we're back with another great show. I've got Robert Smith, Dr. Robert Smith, for those of you Ohio State fans that remember watching him play at Ohio State, his semi-medical career. He, of course, is now in the media, and he's with Fox full-time, but he will always be Dr. Robert Smith to me. I remember watching him as a kid, great running back. So we've got him coming up on the show. You'll hear what he has to say about Ohio State's season, the Big Ten, college football playoff, contenders in general, and his thoughts on college football. That is coming up later on the show. Ross Fulton of Buckeye Grove will be along here in a few minutes. We're going to talk some football with him. We're going to talk about Ohio State's offense today, and then probably next week we'll get into some defense with Ross, but we're going to talk about what he expects from the Ohio State offense this year. You probably heard Urban Meyer saying that they're going to become a very RPO-heavy, which means run-pass option, and Ross is going to explain that and the subtle variances from becoming a read option type of team to an RPO team. So we'll talk about all of that with Ross here coming up. Before we get into football, I wanted to do a little recap of some basketball from the weekend. As you know, the basketball tournament, the regionals were held this weekend. On Friday night, the Scarlet and Gray team, Ohio State's alumni, they won in the regional semifinals. Unfortunately, however, they were not able to get it done on Sunday as they went down, losing by 20 points to Team Fredette. That is the Fighting Jimmer Fredettes, as I've been calling them. The game itself, there's not much to talk about. Jared Sullinger did play after some questions as to whether he'd be available with his wedding over the weekend. He did play, but unfortunately it didn't really matter. The whole team just did not match the energy of Team Fredette. They did not look very crisp. They were struggling on offense, just not very good passing, not very good ball control. And they just were not able to come up with any kind of defensive scheme that really got Team Fredette out of the rhythm. You got to give Team Fredette some credit. Look, that team was very skilled. Jimmer Fredette is one of the best offensive players I think I've seen in this tournament. He was one of the best players in college basketball, so it's not surprising that he still scores at a prodigious pace. But their whole team, very tough to defend. They can shoot, they can drive, they can distribute. So the Scarlet and Gray is done with this tournament, and the basketball tournament now winding down as we're down to the Final Four, but it will go forward without the Ohio State alumni. very disappointing to see Ohio State bow out. But there is another part of this that I wanted to talk about today, and you've probably been reading Twitter. I know if you're reading my Twitter account at KYLam8, I've been talking about a lot about the Elam Ending, and I'm very excited about this format, and it's something that has merited and warranted and triggered a lot of discussion on social media as to whether it should be applied to college basketball and the NBA. And for those of you that have not followed or do not know what the Elam Ending is because you have not watched the basketball tournament, let me explain. Elam Ending, basically this tournament, the TBT, has been adopting what's called the Elam Ending, and it's named after the guy that created it. Basically, instead of playing out the last 4 minutes of the clock, so when you get to the under 4-minute mark at the first dead ball, instead of playing out those last 4 minutes, what they do is they add 7 points to the winning team's score. Whoever's ahead, they just add 7 points, and that becomes the target score, meaning they play until one team reaches that number. Now, I know this is a foreign concept because we're so hardwired to play against the clock. And I know it's something that would require a radical change, a radical line of thinking as to how sports are played for us here in America, because it's just not something we're accustomed to. I kind of liken it to the opposite of what Major League Baseball has done with the Home Run Derby, because Home Run Derby is different now in that baseball does not traditionally use a clock. You go by innings instead of a running clock. So they added this running clock to Home Run Derby, and it made it a lot more exciting. College basketball, if it were to go to the Elam Ending, it would kind of be doing the exact opposite, because we would be getting away from the running clock to end the game, and instead we would be using just kind of the playground mentality. And I know a lot of people don't like the sound of that. They don't want to go to a playground mentality for college basketball. But here's why I'm going to make my case for why I think this would work for college basketball. And I heard this on Twitter, one person saying, at very least, I think we owe it to college basketball to implement it as an experimental rule. One thing I like about the NCAA is they do a lot of testing. They get a lot of feedback. Some of these experimental rules they'll throw in. They'll try it in the preseason with exhibition and scrimmage games. They'll try it in the lower postseason tournaments, the NIT, the CIT, CBI. Some of these postseason tournaments are a great breeding ground for experimental rules to see how they're going to go and get an idea in real live action. And I think this would be a great way to implement the Elam Ending. Now, the one used in the TBT is 7 points. So if you're up 5 at the under 4 dead ball, then that means basically you're up 5 and you have 7 points added to the score. So really, you need to just prohibit the other team from outscoring you 12-4 or 12-6 in that scenario. But you're trying to get to a certain score, and what that does is it eliminates stall ball. It eliminates the free throw parade. Instead of sending teams to the free throw line every possession under 1 minute. Basically, it just encourages and incentivizes teams to play from behind by playing great defense. The shot clock continues to run, and you're just trying to get stops. And even the winning team, if you're up by 10 points with the Elam Ending in effect, instead of trying to milk the clock, you're still trying to play out possessions. And the reason I like this, aside from the fact that my good friend David Griggs, who is a puppet Twitter account, aside from that, the fact that he dislikes this, and Mike DeCourcy, who's kind of an old-timer, very, very traditional, and I have nothing wrong with that. There are some reasons to not necessarily go in full bore with wanting this format. But aside from the fact people like that do not want it, and it'd be easy for me to joke around and say that's the reason right there we should have it, there are some reasons. So, for instance, the number one most common objection I've heard so far to going to the Elam Ending in college basketball is that it would do away with buzzer beaters in college basketball, or take away the excitement of that one-possession game when you're not just trying to beat the team that you're trailing or that you're ahead, but you're also trying to beat the clock. Now, to me, that is a fair objection. That's a fair concern for college basketball. But I looked the data up, and it's remarkable as to how many games how few games actually come down to the wire. So the data for college basketball, and this is I believe a 5-year span, over 56% of all games are decided by at least 10 points or more. 71% of all games in Division I are decided by 3 possessions, which is 7 points or more. That means only 29% of all games are decided by 2 possessions or fewer. That's 6 points or fewer. So, and I don't have data on buzzer beaters, but I went through just 100 games out of a subset of those 1 possession games, 3 points or less, and I went through and just did a 100 game sample, and I found in the 100 games, extrapolating, assuming these numbers are similar, and I assume that they probably are, I was able to extrapolate approximately about 0.7% of all games ended on a buzzer beater last year. So the point I'm trying to make here, while I completely sympathize with not wanting to do away with buzzer beaters in college basketball, I find it interesting that most of the games in college basketball are not coming down to the wire. And why I like the Elam ending is maybe it won't be as exciting as buzzer beaters. You know, maybe winning by a point with the Elam ending is not as exciting without the clock. I don't know. That's something we would probably have to see a bigger sample size. We'd probably have to see more of these games to really get a good feel for how that's going to feel for us. I have a feeling some of it is just going to be experience. You know, most of these things we like about college basketball right now, the 3-point line, the shot clock, these things have not been around very long relative to college basketball. You know, the argument Mike DeCourcy made on the Sporting News was it goes against 100 years plus of basketball tradition. But the 3-point line has only been around for 20 years. College basketball began, James Naismith started college basketball in 1891. The 3-point line, did not come around until 95 years later. The shot clock didn't come around until 90-some years later. So these are changes that have been gradually added to college basketball, and I think it's okay to experiment with this idea. And I think we would find that while we will lose the thrill of the occasional buzzer beater, most of these games are not coming down to buzzer beaters. Like I said, 56% of these games are decided by 10 points or more. Now, what that means is the majority of these basketball games, you're not going to get the boring, lethargic ends where you just see the reserves come in and just ho-hum milk the clock for 30 seconds at a time. And you're not going to see the free throw parades, sending everybody to the free throw line on every possession. It forces every single game to end on a made basket. It forces teams to continue playing. It forces teams to continue playing defense. I really think this would be great for college basketball. I understand some of the arguments against it. One of the things is, you're going to have a natural asterisk in the record books when you look back at history, when you compare records and points per game and all that stuff. There's going to be a clear difference in the era. It would change things radically. But I think that's not necessarily bad. I think not all change is bad, and it's something that we would adjust to. I think as far as the excitement of the game and the future, millennials right now, attention spans are a little less. We know that, and sports are adapting to that concept. And so I think it's good for basketball in the sense that almost every game is guaranteed to being under 2 hours. Yeah, you're going to lose the overtimes. With the Elam ending, there is no overtime. That's a drawback. Maybe you could institute you have to win by 2 points on free throws or something like that if you're shooting free throws. I don't know. There are other ways to manipulate the Elam ending. But you are going to lose overtime, but by the same token, the end of these games go by so much quicker because you don't have the fouls, you don't have the extraneous timeouts. I really like this. Some people have argued no other sport changes the way games are ended, and that's true to an extent if you're looking at regulation, but you got to keep in mind the NFL goes to sudden death overtime. The NHL goes to a shootout if after 3-on-3 overtime does not yield a goal. So there are absolutely sports that are changing the way games are ended. So, yeah, they're not changing the way regulation games are ended. All these situations are overtime, but they still end in a way that is not consistent with how the game is played. So I don't think college basketball doing away with the clock at the end of the game is necessarily something that has to be the end-all of the discussion. Anyway, it is the Elam ending. I am all in favor of this. Like I said, for the biggest reason, it's going to increase the excitement on a majority of these basketball games. The ones that are 7 points, 10 points, 12 points, you're no longer playing and milking the clock. You're no longer having the long, strung-out free throw parades. It makes the game more exciting. You think back to the NCAA tournament 4 or 5 years back, Wisconsin and Arizona. What was it, 20-some minutes? I think 25 minutes of actual time to play the last minute of the game. The Elam ending is going to do away with games like that and those kind of outliers. And so I'm all in favor of it. If nothing else, I say at least experiment with the Elam ending in college basketball, and let's see what we have, and then we can make a better informed decision going forward. So that's my idea. That's my tangent. What do you think about the Elam ending and being applied to college basketball? Hit me up on Twitter at KYLam, 8. I would love to hear the reasons you're either for or against this. And I think it's an interesting discussion, and I hope that the NCAA and the powers that be within the governance at least take a look at going to this. Don't just jump into it. Certainly, I would say test it first, but I think it's something worth taking a look at. Anyhow, let's get into some football talk. As I said, I've got Robert Smith's interview coming up now, and then shortly right after that, we're going to go into talking OSU offense for 2018 and into prospects with Ross Bolton. So let's jump right into it. So let's start off, let's talk a little bit about Ohio State here. So you as a running back yourself probably have an inclination to maybe see more what's happening with other running backs across the country. I want to ask you about Mike Weber and J.K. Dobbins and kind of get your take on how you see those two progressing in 2018 for the Buckeyes.
Well, I think they're just going to continue the way that they'd started. Weber obviously was a little bit banged up at the beginning of the year last year, and J.K. Dobbins really kind of exploded onto the scene. But, they're both explosive players. I think they both need to have the ball in their hands at some point. And I think Herbert and this staff are going to find a way to get both of them on the field at the same time, as we saw in some occasions a year ago. And it's really tough as a defense really to account for these guys because it can hurt you in so many ways.
How do you see this offense evolving with the new quarterback? Do you think they are going to try to fit the offense around the quarterback, or do you see the offense being somewhat similar and maybe just tweaks with Haskins at quarterback? How do you see that playing out this year?
Yeah, I think you never want to try and fit square pegs into a round hole. So to a degree, you always have to kind of look at your personnel and say, what are the kind of things that this quarterback can do? And I don't think that Haskins will ever be the runner that we saw JT Barrett be, and certainly not to the extent. So you kind of have to fit the offense to him and have the running backs carry more of that load. And that's what you can do with with two excellent backs like that. You can get both those guys in the backfield, a little misdirection. So I think you can see some of that. But then you want to certainly let him try and air the ball out, because he certainly has a good arm and makes good decisions with football.
When it comes to the Ohio State roster, what areas are you going to be most intrigued by? Maybe the biggest question marks or questions you have for Ohio State going into the season.
Really, kind of looking at the front seven on defense, and I know that they've certainly done a great job of replacing corners in the past, but you lose some solid players in those areas. So that's probably it for me. I think that the offenses on Urban Meyer, we always know he's going to have those guys, and just I think kind of looking at that front seven in particular on defense, it's the biggest area of concern for me.
Ohio State obviously has a lot of competition in the Big Ten East this year, and of course there's going to be a lot of expectations on Michigan, to finally perform and beat Michigan State, beat Ohio State. What kind of level of expectation do you think the fans and media should have for Michigan, given the competition in the East? What do you think is a realistic, fair expectation for that program?
Well, you're never really sure. I mean, I think they could, they could have won against Ohio State a year ago, and they could have won against Michigan State a year ago. Wisconsin kind of pounded them. They were never really in that one, but those other two could have gone either way. So, looking at the roster this year, bringing in Shea Patterson is going to be huge for this offense. They haven't run the ball the way that they wanted to in years past, I think, in part because they haven't really threatened people with the passing game the way that Shea Patterson will be able to. So, when you look at them defensively, so difficult when you've got a guy like Chase Winovich on one side and Rashawn Gary on the other. It's tough to slide protections and account for both of those guys coming off of the edge. So it can leave you with some unfavorable matchups and one-on-ones that you don't want to have with guys that do such a great job of getting into opposing offensive backfield. So I think the roster's in great shape. Don Brown was an unbelievable hire as a defensive coordinator, so all the pieces are there. And on offense, Shea Patterson is there. I think this is a team that feels and would be justified in feeling that they belong as Big Ten champs.
Do you think there's there's as many as maybe 5 Big Ten teams kind of pushing that top 10, top 15 threshold coming into the season? Do you think that that is a fair stance? Do you see that many teams being that good, or do you think there's kind of a carryover from the success the Big Ten had in the bowls last year?
No, I think it's justified. You look at these teams, you look at what a lot of those teams have coming back, but it's college football, and I think people would be wise to always remember that. You're talking about 18 to 22-year-old kids, and a lot of things can happen throughout the course of the season with injuries, just kind of the way that players are mentally from week to week. So I think it makes sense to have that many teams there, but it always comes down to the product on the field, the way that they actually end up playing.
One of the big themes with media days here is I think Wisconsin is understandably the overwhelming favorite in the West. Do you see any of those other teams being a legitimate challenger, whether it's Purdue continuing their improvement under Jeff Brom or Nebraska in the first year under Scott Frost? Do you see any of those teams being a threat to knock off Wisconsin?
Well, I think Iowa is a team that could certainly find themselves in there. I believe that Iowa gets them at home this year. They have to go to Penn State, but the rest of their schedule sets up pretty nicely for them because they avoid Michigan, they avoid Penn State, and they avoid Ohio State out of the West. So I think Iowa's a team that if you're Wisconsin, you have to be concerned about.
Yeah, I think Ohio State learned that lesson the hard way.
Yeah, exactly.
You just never know with Iowa City. So if you look around the college football landscape, a lot of the preseason, the odds-on favorites, you see Alabama, Clemson, Ohio State, I think are the 3 consistently come up. Georgia's thrown in that mix too. As far as the college football playoff, are there any teams out there that maybe fly under the radar that you think have a good chance or a decent chance to make the college football playoff this year that aren't getting talked about enough?
Well, I think that the Big Ten teams have a legitimate shot. I mean, Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State, and Wisconsin, certainly, if not Michigan State. But when you look around the country, I think, you don't have a lot of people talking about Washington. We're going to learn a lot about them against Auburn in week 1. They could find themselves in that mix as well. So, Big 12, I wouldn't be shocked to see Texas this year make it into the college football playoff. The Big 12, a lot of teams replacing quarterbacks, and that could be an ideal situation for a Texas team that's got 2 experienced quarterbacks that should be healthier this year. They play against a USC team that's going to have a new starter quarterback. So Tech, I think, is another one of those teams that, it wouldn't shock me to see them get their way into the playoff.
Last question I wanted to ask you here before I let you go. So, we've got a big non-conference matchup coming up this year with Ohio State TCU down in Dallas, and we've seen more of these matchups starting to trickle into the schedules, now that we're 4 or 5 years removed from the start of the playoff. Do you think this trend is going to continue? That seems to be a byproduct, the scheduling, that is non-conference scheduling, seems to be a byproduct of having those extra playoff spots. And do you think this is something we'll continue to see as we go forward?
Yeah, I definitely do, because we know that the playoff committee values strength of schedule, or at least strength of record, kind of how these teams are attempting to challenge themselves. And we've seen teams make it into the playoff based on the difference of that non-conference schedule. And we've seen teams survive losses in those non-conference games. So if a team loses one of those games, goes on to become a conference champion, particularly if they remain with just that one loss, I think they see more value in doing it and scheduling those kind of tough games.
Robert Smith, you can catch him on Fox Sports, upcoming college football season coverage. Appreciate you taking the time, and have a great time. Enjoy the rest of your day in Chicago.
Okay, thanks.
Ross Fulton is here with his whiteboard to break down what the Buckeyes and their opponents are doing on the field. Can't see the whiteboard? Close your eyes and imagine really hard. It's time to go inside the X's and O's with Ross.
Pain heals. Chicks dig scars. Glory lasts forever.
I'm here now talking some football with Ross Fulton. And Ross, thank you for joining me on the podcast. It's good to have you make your debut appearance here on Unscripted Ohio.
Happy to do so. Looking forward to it.
So we are, as we record this, we're just, a couple days away from being August. Football camp starts next week, August 3rd to be exact. So we're right around the corner from football season. A lot to talk about here because Ohio State, even though they return a good majority of the roster at key positions, we're talking about a couple changes, especially at quarterback with Dwayne Haskins taking over. And as you've talked about on Twitter this past week, that means some interesting transition coming for Ohio State offensively as to how they're going to structure the offense. So let's start with that. So you said this week on Twitter, one of the things coming out from Urban Meyer this past week is that they're going to be more of an RPO team instead of a read team. Why don't you go ahead and explain what that's going to mean in terms of how Ohio State looks offensively?
Sure. So I should say that reads versus RPOs are somewhat two sides of the same coin. They're the same basic concept. But so what it means, practically speaking, is Ohio State will remain a power spread offense. They'll continue to operate from the shotgun. The run game will look pretty similar. That power spread is built upon the concept of reading an unblocked defender. So at its basics, football is 11 on 11. And arithmetic-wise, the defense always outnumbers the offense because you have a ball carrier. The problem then comes, though, once the quarterback hands off, you now have two unblocked defenders and that the offense has to account for. So the way that Urban Meyer and many other spread teams deal with that is they re-equate numbers by having the quarterback read one of those defenders. Well, the difference between a read versus RPO basically is with a read play, as we've seen many times with J.T. Barrett and Braxton Miller before him, is if they read that defender and he overcommits, the quarterback keeps and runs. An RPO or run-pass option, you continue to read a defender. The difference, though, is rather than the quarterback keeping, they can throw a quick pass, often a screen or a slant or hitch type route. And so that has a couple, it keeps your quarterback from running, obviously, which if they're not the athlete that a Braxton Miller or Barrett is, that can be a good thing. It also creates more options for the offense in terms of who you can read and what you can do. And so that in its practice will result in probably a higher percentage of passes a season, even if the plays are similar.
I heard Urban really stressing in Chicago about wanting to use the tight end a lot. They plan on using all four guys on the roster, including Jeremy Ruckert coming in as a freshman. Is that partially a product of some of those quick passes you talked about in the run-pass option, maybe quick hitters to the tight end? Is that something that is a byproduct of doing more of the RPO?
Maybe. Color me skeptical on that. on that front. I feel like Urban Meyer sometimes says things for motivational purposes. To me, if I was going to, a point that Meyer makes, and I heard him say it this week, is I've heard him use different numbers, but bottom line is he puts together a list of his biggest playmakers and wants to make sure they touch the football. And for Ohio State this season, it has to start with you have your two tailbacks back, and Dobbins and Mike Weber, and then you have all 6 leading wide receivers returning. So I think they'll be, as I said, I think they will throw the football more this season in general. So I wouldn't be surprised if the tight ends are a part of that. But on those RPO plays, just like we saw both against Michigan when Dwayne Haskins came in the spring, I think a lot of them at the beginning will feature the H slot receiver going to Paris Campbell and KJ Hill.
How much do you think they will continue to incorporate the read option under Haskins? We know running is not his biggest strong suit. It's not that he can't run, but he's certainly no JT Barrett when it comes to not only reading a defense, but also actually being able to physically run. So how much do you think they will keep that in the playbook? Do you believe we'll still see it occasionally, and if so, how much?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we'll see it occasionally just because I think it's such a bread and butter of the offense. I think it would be impossible for it to go away. Again, sort of the Michigan game was a bit of a petri dish on that front. Obviously, they had to adjust on the fly, but even when adjusting on the fly with Dwayne Haskins, you saw quite a bit of a change between the first half and the second half. So you saw a little bit of read option. And as you said, Haskins, he can move. I mean, he had that scramble. The problem is, as much the read option, as much as just being a good athlete, it also requires both, as you said, being able to read the defense, but also be kind of quick twitch and run more like a tailback. And he's just kind of a lanky guy who isn't quite that quick off the line. So I think you'll see it a little bit, but I think you'll see to make up for that a lot more, not only, as we said, the run-pass option, but also much more of gap and counter blocking to add more variety and make the pure zone read a smaller part of the offense.
So in theory, and this was something that I talked about with Joel Klatt on the podcast last week, and he called it the $1 million question, and we talked about how, under JT Barrett at quarterback, the zone read really was kind of a fallback, a crutch at times for Urban Meyer to lean into. When they had a 3rd and 3, 3rd and 4, it was still within range of using that, and they certainly did use it a lot. They won't have that at their disposal early. What do you think they are going to do? Do you think they'll have something to fall back with Dwayne Haskins, or is it going to force them to build trust at them throwing the ball maybe a little bit more than they've been comfortable with the last few years?
I think it will force them to throw it more than they've been comfortable with. I think that there's a great chicken and egg question with JT Barrett, and even after watching countless snaps of JT Barrett over and over, I don't have a great answer necessarily on whether it was the fact that it was the play calling holding back the offense a little bit, or whether the coaching staff recognized Barrett's limitations and didn't want to push it, knew what his strengths were, which is ultimately carrying and short yardage and being a read guy. In fact, I thought it was interesting this past week that Meyer, maybe for the first time I quite ever heard him kind of criticize Barrett as a passer. He talked about in the Wisconsin game how there were multiple open receivers downfield that they just missed that could have opened that game up. And so I do think, and I'm going to your conversation with Joel, I do think there is a higher upside there. However, I do think we all are a little spoiled with how easy it was for Ohio State to convert those short yardage situations with JT Barrett. And so I think it's going to be there's going to be a little bit of a learning curve and a little bit of maybe some starting and stopping for the coaching staff and the players to adjust to not having that crutch.
Who are you looking forward to in the Ohio State receiving corps being the biggest benefactors from Dwayne Haskins being quarterback and theoretically opening up the field downfield with more consistent routes and more deep balls than we've seen in the past few years?
Yeah, I think the two people that jump out to me, both at the X receiver, are Austin Mack and Benjamin Victor, because one thing that I've seen them consistently do with Dwayne Haskins, whether it was against Michigan or in the spring game, because of his arm strength, one thing they like to use is what I call vertical stem routes on the outside. So basically, it's just a read for the wide receiver. You're going 12, 15 yards downfield. If the cornerback's off you, you're coming back to the quarterback. If you have tight coverage, you're releasing and going deep. And Haskins, probably his most famous completion was to Austin Mack on that route on 3rd down against Michigan. And you'll continually see those. So I think those two guys, and then again, I think Campbell and Hill at the H are going to have a lot of receptions, whether it be on run pass options, quick out routes on third down, to make up to your previous question, some of those short yardage conversions and other types of shallow crossing routes.
Ohio State fans have got to be salivating the thought. I think if there's maybe one criticism on Haskins as a passer right now, he's still got to master those soft touch throws. But to think about the possibility of those back shoulder throws to Ben Victor downfield, that could be potentially a lot of fun to watch this year for sure, and we'll see beyond this year.
Yeah, I think we all have to temper our expectations a little bit. I think that the potential is certainly there. I hate ever jumping out too far in front and just assuming that Haskins is going to, far outperform what JT Barrett did. Ohio State won a lot of games with JT Barrett, who, for some of his faults, kept the chains moving. So I do think that there could be, as I said, some growing pains. I certainly do think, though, that the Haskins' upside and the potential to stretch the field in the passing game as well as with the run game creates a higher upside for Ohio State in the long run.
We're talking with Ross Fulton of Buckeye Grove. You can catch Ross on Twitter at Ross R. Fulton. We'll talk about some defense with Ross here probably next week or the week after as we get closer to the start of the season. But today we're focusing on the offensive side of the ball. Ross, how much of a drop-off do you expect there being with a couple key losses there on the offensive line? I think for me personally, the biggest one obviously is Billy Price in the middle. I think that's going to be the one that's hardest to replace. I actually think with Thayer Munford stepping in at tackle, I have a feeling they're not going to miss too much of a beat there, with no disrespect to Jamarco Jones, who's been great for Ohio State. But Billy Price, for me, is the big loss I'm not sure they're going to be able to replace, especially early in the year. What kind of drop-off do you expect there to be both in the run game and pass protection?
Yeah, I expect some. I think it's somewhat hard to quantify. I agree with you. I worry about both the left tackle and center position for Ohio State, but I think that Billy Price is going to be very difficult to replace, and it's sort of an amorphous. I think they're kind of in a interesting situation where, assuming that Brandon Bowen comes back, I think that three of their best players are probably at guard in Bowen, or three of their best linemen, I should say, in Bowen, Knox, and Michael Jordan. So it'll be interesting if they all stay there and that one of them doesn't start, or do they move someone around? But I think, some of it will be, some of that, again, offensive line pressure will be alleviated if they can really get the run pass option game working. And that should take some pressure and get some players out of the box that have been in there for the last few seasons and hopefully open things up.
I thought one of the strengths of Ohio State last year was at moments they were able to go with a really, really quick tempo with Price and Barrett because they had the familiarity and they were great leaders offensively. This year with the new battery entirely at center and quarterback, we really don't know what the tempo is going to be like. Do you think that will affect their ability to go fast, and do you think that they want to go fast under Haskins, maybe as much as they have at key times and different points of football games?
I think it will affect it. I think that they want to. I certainly think that Kevin Wilson and Ryan Day probably want to go fast. I think that Meyer sometimes slows them down a little bit as he's looking at the overall game and doesn't want a bunch of quick 3-and-outs if the offense is not moving. But again, I think it'll just be somewhat dependent on how the offense is functioning as a whole. Tempo is easy to do when you're moving the chains and gaining first downs. It becomes harder when things are getting a little rough. So I think tempo will be when you're looking at cause and effect, I think that the ability to use tempo will be an effect of an offense that's functioning with the new starters.
What do you think is a fair expectation for this offense as a whole in terms of production in this upcoming season?
Again, I think it's a little bit, to me, like if I was looking at JT Barrett, he's sort of a singles and doubles player. You know what you're getting. There wasn't ever a ton of huge upside, but he also removed the strikeout. This year, there's just a little bit more unknown. I mean, I think the upside and the potential is excellent. Not only with Haskins' his ability to stretch the field, but Bill Connelly's stats has long showed that one of the biggest predictors of offensive success is your wide receiver production returning, and Ohio State has their entire wide receiver production returning, probably for the first time since 2015. And put that together with the two tailbacks, you have a lot of potential there. So really, it comes down to Haskins and those couple offensive linemen. I think, though, that their potential is there to be a much better offense than they have been the last couple of years.
Yeah, they literally have their top 7 receivers back that caught passes last year. That's incredible. I don't know that doesn't happen very often. I'm sure it's happened before, but it doesn't happen very often. And you throw in, both Dobbins and Weber returning, and Dwayne Haskins certainly is not going to be without weapons this year.
No, exactly. So I think it really comes down to, I think most people assume Haskins will be all right and, take over without much of a hitch, and then it just comes down to the offensive line play, as it often does.
Ross Fulton of Buckeye Grove. Ross, that's great stuff. You can catch Ross on Twitter at RossRFulton. You can also listen to him in the upcoming season. We will definitely have him on Mondays breaking down games and previewing the upcoming games as well. So we're very excited. Ross will be a part of the show. Definitely full bore when football season comes around. We'll have him a couple more times before the season starts as well. Ross, I appreciate you taking the time and talking some great football with us.
Absolutely, Kyle. Happy to do it, and we're getting pretty close now.
That is going to wrap things up for the Unscripted Ohio podcast for today. One quick basketball note for basketball fans of Ohio State out there. Reminder tomorrow, that is Tuesday, July 31st, there is an open basketball practice for the Ohio State basketball team as they make their final preparations for the Spain basketball trip, which will commence on Wednesday. They will leave. They'll be over there for 5 days playing basketball in Spain. So you can catch them in action at Value City Arena at the Schottenstein Center. Gates open at 5 p.m. tomorrow. That is Tuesday, July 31st. Gates open at 5 p.m. Practice will start shortly thereafter. You'll be able to catch about a half hour of them practicing, half hour to 45 minutes, I believe it is. And then Chris Holtman and a select few players will be speaking to the public afterwards. So great family event. If you have kids, maybe want to see Ohio State basketball players, I'm sure there'll probably be the opportunity for a couple autographs here or there. But either way, if you want to get a first glimpse at the Ohio State basketball team for 2018 and 19, here's your chance tomorrow, Tuesday, July 31st at 5 p.m. That'll last for about an hour and a half, including the interviews afterwards. So, Buckeye fans, here's your chance to get your first glimpse of Ohio State basketball. If you cannot make it, don't worry. I'll be sure to give my own synopsis of what I saw of this team in a short glimpse in practice. I'll give that on Friday, and I'll try to catch people up to speed with what I think of what I've seen so far. I got to see them one time at the open practice to the media last week, so this will be my second chance to see some of the new guys, Luther Muhammad, Justin Ahrens, Jaden Leday. I can tell you they all look physically very impressive. I think you're going to like this team. Very young, very inexperienced, but a lot of potential. So Ohio State open practice for basketball tomorrow, Tuesday, July 31st. Gates open at Value City Arena at 5 p.m. That is going to do it for today. Once again, you can catch us Monday and Friday on BuckeyeGrove.com. Catch us on the archives, iTunes, Google Play, SoundCloud, and Stitcher. We'll be back at you Friday for another edition of Unscripted Ohio. Thank you for making us part of your day. Thank you for listening. Go Bucks.
You can get new episodes of Unscripted Ohio on Mondays and Fridays exclusively at BuckeyeGrove.com or anytime on SoundCloud, iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date on all things Ohio State.